In the dark wilds of Idaho, something stirs beneath the surface, under lakes, in forests, through canyons where sunlight dies early and stories live too long. These aren't bedtime fables or tourist traps. These are the things that never left. From 12-legged river beasts to child-snatching giants, each one whispers the same question: what if the land remembers its monsters better than we remember the land? Welcome to 30 terrifying mythical creatures of Idaho. You're not lost. You're exactly where they want you. Before we dive in, if you love unsettling mysteries, forgotten folklore, and creatures that probably aren't supposed to exist, hit subscribe and join the expedition. And hey, while you're here, where are you watching from? What time is it right now where you are? Drop it in the comments. We want to know who's brave enough to listen to Idaho's monsters in the dark. 1. Charlie, Payette Lake, McCall. Payette Lake is beautiful. That's what everyone says. Tourists roll into McCall every year to marvel at its serene blue waters, pine-ringed shores, and the kind of crisp air that makes you forget your inbox exists. It's the kind of lake that shows up on postcards and Instagram stories labeled "hard healing," but there's something else about Payette Lake, something older, something colder, something that surfaces just long enough to make you doubt what you know about still water. They call it Charlie. The name sounds like a bad joke, like the friendly ghost your aunt insists used to live in her attic. In truth, the name Charlie is a watered-down nickname layered over a series of accounts that are anything but whimsical. Charlie is McCall's version of a lake monster, a serpentine figure said to glide just beneath the water's surface like a shadow that's not yours. The first widely accepted sighting happened in 1920. A group on a boat claimed to see something break the glassy surface of the lake, something big, dark, and undulating. They described a log-like shape that moved of its own accord. People laughed, shrugged, went back to their picnics. Then it happened again in 1944, this time with multiple witnesses, including a local newspaper editor, a lumberman, and several townsfolk who had no reason to conspire. They watched a creature rise and ripple across the lake's mirror-like calm, describing it as at least 35 feet long, with humps that rolled like a swimming camel's back. After that, Charlie became a local fixture, a mascot, a mystery commodified. There were buttons, t-shirts, a community contest in the 1950s dubbed the creature Charlie, a deliberate play on Nessie, the Loch Ness Monster. But the cutesy name didn't change the fact that no one could explain what the hell they were seeing. Log, boat wake, rogue sturgeon, submerged elk? No theory ever quite matched the descriptions, especially the movement, which observed 35 feet long, with humps that rolled like a swimming camel's back. Was he echoing a folk memory? Was he cursed with the rare condition of actually seeing the truth? You could spend all day arguing about the origins of the monster. Was it a misidentified sturgeon, a beaver caravan, a hallucination induced by the altitude and an unhealthy obsession with Mormon ghost stories? Or was it something older, something that can't be explained by taxonomy or tabloid psychology? Because even if Rich made it up, someone else didn't. The Shoshone tell of a water being that lives beneath the surface, not just to scare, but to warn, a thing that doesn't belong to the categories we've built. Not fish, not God, not ghost, just presence. And that's what you'll feel if you ever get too quiet at Bear Lake. That presence, not a scream or a splash or a hiss, just a watching, like the lake remembers something you forgot, or like it's waiting for you to remember something you buried. Of course, Bear Lake isn't the only Utah body of water with a reputation for hosting things that shouldn't be there. Just west, the Great Salt Lake, miles wide, shallow, bitter, and dying, hides a beast even stranger, one with a crocodile's body, a horse's head, and a name you don't really want to say out loud. Let's call it Old Briny. Not a scream or a splash or a hiss, just a watching, like the lake remembers something you forgot, or like it's waiting for you to remember something you buried. 2. Old Briny, North Shore Monster. The Great Salt Lake is where Utah goes to evaporate. It's not really a lake, not in the normal sense, more like a slow, alkaline exhale from the desert itself. It smells like brine shrimp and disuse. It steams in the summer and freezes in winter, but never in a friendly way. And for the better part of 2 centuries, it's also been home, at least according to a handful of deeply unnerved salt workers, to a thing that should not be here, a thing they started calling Old Briny. It began in the summer of 1877. That's when a crew working near the lake's north shore, gritty, sunburned men employed by the Barnes and Cumbie Salt Works, came running back to town with a story that was impossible to tell without laughing or sweating. They said they'd seen something emerge from the lake, something tall, something grotesque, something alive. It had the body of a crocodile, scaled and lurching. But where a crocodile's snout should have been, there was the head of a horse, eyes bulging, teeth bared, foaming at the mouth. Some said it bellowed, others said it just stared. But the most consistent part of the story was this: it charged, the workers scattered. One man reportedly fired his rifle at it and fled. No one stuck around to find the body. No tracks were found, no blood, no trail, just salt and silence. Now, the thing about salt is it preserves not just fish and meat and skin, but stories too. So even if the creature had never truly lived, the tale of it stayed unnervingly fresh. You can still find the original Deseret News article reporting the event. Its tone caught somewhere between alarm and local amusement, but no one quite laughed it off. Not really, because the Great Salt Lake has a history of being inconsistent. It swells, it shrinks, it burps up old railroad tracks and swallows cars. It gleams like a mirror and reeks like something dead. It's beautiful and harsh and wrong all at once. So if a lake were ever going to produce a mythological mishmash of a beast, this one would. In the years since that first 1877 sighting, the story of Old Briny has mutated. Some say it's winged now, a kind of aerial dragon that flaps from island to island at night. Others say it lives beneath the causeway and only surfaces when the lake hits certain salinity levels, as if chemistry were its language of resurrection. Skeptics, of course, have explanations: misidentified animals, drunken hallucinations, the heat playing tricks on weary workers, or maybe it was just a clumsy allegory for the railroads encroaching on wild spaces, industry as monster. That's the safe version. But there's another theory, less comfortable. It suggests that the Great Salt Lake doesn't create monsters, it just reveals them. That somewhere in the brackish swirl of brine shrimp, mineral foam, and abandoned boats, there's a boundary that thins. And if you stand in the right place at the right moment, you might see something not meant for human eyes, a thing that doesn't belong in our century, or maybe even in this dimension. It just uses the lake the way an actor uses a stage, briefly, effectively, and always leaving behind a sense of dread that no one can clean up. Still, Old Briny isn't the lake's only anomaly. The monster stories didn't stop in 1877. They just migrated south mostly toward a freshwater cousin where the water's cleaner, but the legends are murkier. Because down in Utah County, another beast was making waves. This one had the body of a serpent, the head of a greyhound, and a tendency to show up when least expected. They called it the Utah Lake Monster, and it never quite went away, and always leaving behind a sense of dread that no one can clean up. Still, Old Briny isn't the lake's only anomaly. The monster stories didn't stop in 1877. They just migrated south mostly toward a freshwater cousin where the water's cleaner, but the legends are murkier. If you're still with us after that, good. That means Old Briny didn't get you yet, Before we meet the next lake dwelling nightmare, hit that subscribe button so you don't end up missing something you'll wish you hadn't seen. And let us know in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it? We're keeping track because some creatures only show up when the clock hits the wrong hour. 3. Utah Lake Monster. Utah Lake has always felt a bit too calm for comfort. It's shallow, warm, unnervingly still, like a sheet of polished glass laid over something that wishes you wouldn't look too closely. It's the kind of place where rumors linger longer than footprints, where fishermen tell each other things they don't really believe, but somehow keep repeating. And since the 1860s, they've all agreed on one thing: something is alive in that water that shouldn't be. The Utah Lake Monster never really got a name, but it got plenty of descriptions. According to settlers who moved into the Utah Valley in the mid-19th century, the creature was large, very large, though no two people could seem to agree on how large. Some said it stretched 30 feet from snout to tail. Others claimed it was closer to 60. A few insisted it could wrap itself around a small boat, but what they all remembered was its head. It had the long, narrow face of a greyhound, thin, pointed, alert, and a mouth lined with teeth that didn't belong on anything living in a freshwater lake. Witnesses said it moved like a snake, except faster, more controlled, like it was watching, like it was waiting. One of the most famous accounts came from two men fishing near the lake's edge who said the beast lunged at their boat, sending them rowing for their lives. Another claimed it chased a team of horses into the water before disappearing into the depths. These reports weren't confined to one location: Lehigh, Saratoga Springs, Provo. They all had stories. It was as if the lake itself was infected with the memory of the creature. But what makes this monster interesting isn't just the consistency of the sightings, it's their persistence. Stories didn't die out with the 19th century, they just changed tone. In the 1920s, a group of boys claimed they saw something massive in the lake while swimming. In the 1980s, there were murmurings of sightings near the Lincoln Beach area. And even in the 2000s, local publications still ran the occasional feature asking, is something still lurking in Utah Lake? Of course, there are explanations. There are always explanations. A sturgeon, maybe, an out-of-place, oversized fish, a river otter seen in low light, or maybe just wind patterns forming a serpentine wake on the water's surface. That's what the scientists say, or at least what they imply before shuffling to the next question. But Utah Lake has never been just a body of water. It's been a battleground, an ecosystem on the edge of collapse, a sacred site to the Ute people, long before settlers ever dipped a paddle into its waters. And maybe that history is part of the story. Maybe what people are seeing is less a creature and more a consequence, a ripple of something older than biology, a warning wrapped in scales. Because what happens when you keep building on haunted ground, when you drain wetlands, poison the water, and push out the people who once knew how to read the land? Maybe the lake remembers. Maybe it sends a messenger. And if you've ever stood near the muddy banks on a summer night when the air gets strangely quiet and the water turns unusually black, you might understand why some people still hesitate before swimming too far from shore, because there's something about Utah Lake that feels occupied. But it gets worse because the lake isn't just home to serpents. It sings, and sometimes it cries. From its depths and its rivers and its hidden springs come stories even older than the monster, stories about babies or something like babies, and what happens when you hear them crying where no baby should be. Quiet, and the water turns unusually black. You might understand why some people still hesitate before swimming too far from shore, because there's something about Utah Lake that feels occupied. But it gets worse because the lake isn't just home to serpents. It sings, and sometimes it cries. From its depths and its rivers and its hidden springs come stories even older than the monster, stories about babies or something like babies, And what happens when you hear them crying? 4. Water babies, Ute Powapicts. If you're walking near Utah Lake or along the Provo River and you suddenly hear the faint sound of a baby crying, don't follow it. That's what the elders say. The water babies, or Powapicks as they're called in Ute tradition, aren't the kind of spirits that announce themselves with thunder or fury. They whisper, they weep, and they wait. Their cries drift over the water like mist, thin, cold, and curiously far away. And those who hear them often say the same thing. It didn't sound like it belonged in the air. It sounded like it came from under it. Water baby stories are told across the Great Basin by the Ute, the Shoshone, the Paiute, and others who've lived with this land longer than any map has had the right to name it. But in Utah, the stories cluster like driftwood around particular places: Utah Lake, the Provo River, springs that run clear and deep in desert canyons, the kinds of places that are too quiet even when they're loud, too still even when the wind is blowing. Descriptions vary, but most accounts agree on the core image: small, human-like figures, child-sized or infant-shaped, with wet, dark skin and unusually powerful eyes. Some say they appear only in sound, never seen, just heard. Others claim that if you get close enough, you'll see them standing at the edge of the water, watching you with an expression that's not quite sad and not quite angry, just ancient. And here's the thing: no two stories explain them the same way. Some say they're the spirits of drowned children, bound forever to the waters that took them. Others say they were never children at all, that there's something else entirely, a kind of protective force that punishes the curious, or a warning system sent by the water itself, echoing with the weight of past violence. Some indigenous teachings describe them not as monsters, but as beings of power, guardians, testers, a reminder that water, like all living things, demands respect. But the subtler versions of the story, naturally, got darker and less nuanced. Local newspapers in the early 20th century occasionally mentioned strange noises near the riverbanks. Campers claimed to have heard crying at night, only to find nothing by daylight. Amateur paranormal groups have conducted night watch sessions with thermal cameras and voice recorders, waiting for the sound of that one unmistakable wail. And the name Water Baby has become clickbait shorthand for something much more complex than a spooky lakeside ghost. There's a strange, almost compulsive irony to how the story gets told. People hear the cry and instinctively search for the source, because that's what humans do. We hear crying and we respond, we comfort, we help, but the water babies don't want your help. They want you to come closer. And if the stories are true, closer is the last place you want to be. Modern skepticism does its usual work. Frogs, coyotes, trickling pipes, the distant echo of a train mistaken for something else. But even skeptics admit that the sound of a baby crying near a body of water taps into something primal, something you can't quite rationalize away, especially when there's no baby and no footprints and no explanation for how the sound seems to move. And when you back away from the edge, heart pounding, ears straining for one more wail, you'll realize that the stillness around you has changed. The birds are quiet. The reeds aren't rustling. 5. Fish Lake Monster. Fish Lake is the kind of place that feels like it's keeping secrets beneath every ripple. Tucked into the high alpine wilderness of central Utah, bordered by aspen forests and steep slopes, it seems too pristine, too idyllic to carry the kind of unease that clings to other bodies of water, but it does, quietly, patiently, like a rumor that knows it doesn't need to shout to be believed. At 6 miles long and over 100 feet deep in some places, Fish Lake is one of Utah's largest natural lakes and one of its coldest. Locals will tell you the fishing is world class, the hiking is unbeatable, and the sunsets are worth the drive. But if you ask the right people and ask quietly, They'll tell you there's something else in the lake too. Something big, something old, something that doesn't care whether you believe in it or not. The Fish Lake Monster doesn't come with the media attention of its Bear Lake or Utah Lake cousins. It's the quiet sibling of the state's aquatic cryptids, less famous, less described, but no less unsettling. Its legend doesn't hinge on one dramatic 19th century headline or a single eyewitness with a flair for embellishment. Instead, the stories are scattered, subtle, more like fragments of a memory shared by people who've spent a little too long alone in the woods. The descriptions that do exist are often vague, long dark shapes seen gliding beneath a boat, sudden waves disturbing the glassy surface of the water on a windless day, the feeling of something massive moving just beneath your feet as you wade in, only to find nothing but your own reflection staring nervously back. Some say it's eel-like. Others compare it to a massive trout or prehistoric gar. There are those who whisper about something reptilian or even mammalian, a shape that breaks the water just enough to prove it's not your imagination. One persistent detail that surfaces again and again is the sheer stillness that seems to accompany the sightings, as if the entire lake inhales. Birds go silent, the breeze drops, and for a moment, the world flattens into that unnerving, pre-thunderstorm hush where something is about to happen, but doesn't. Skeptics will chalk it up to optical illusions, sunlight on deep water, schools of fish triggering surface motion, even logs caught in underwater currents. And sure, those explanations might hold water until you talk to the anglers who swear they've seen something breach the surface and vanish without a sound, or the hikers who paused on the cliffs above the lake and watched something large enough to part the water like a slow-moving boat, yet left no wake behind. Then there are the absences, missing fishing nets, abandoned campsites, the occasional whisper of a diver who went down and came up pale, shaking, unwilling to talk about what he saw near the lake's floor. And while none of these stories make the news, they pass from one local to another like currency. No one claims to know the monster is real, but everyone's heard enough to think twice before swimming past the drop-off. The legend of the Fish Lake Monster doesn't demand your attention. It doesn't perform. It just lingers, unspoken, unproven, and strangely believable in the way that only local folklore can be. A story that doesn't need to shout to be heard because it's already soaked into the soil, the water, and the minds of the people who live nearby. But Fish Lake isn't alone in its reputation. Just west, in the dry heart of Utah's severe desert, there's another place where water once gathered and where, according to dusty newspaper clippings and suspiciously brief eyewitness accounts, something monstrous stirred beneath the waves. That place is called Severe Lake, and whatever lived there didn't stay long or didn't need to. A story that Severe Lake Monster. You wouldn't expect to find a lake monster in a place that mostly doesn't have a lake anymore. That's part of what makes the legend of the Severe Lake Monster so strange. Not just the creature itself, which was described as a classic serpentine water devil in the brief flickers of local lore, but the setting, a mostly dry, sun-scoured playa in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by salt flats, military testing zones, and the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. Today at Sevier Lake is more ghost than lake. Its water levels rise and fall based on snowmelt, seasonal runoff, and the whims of long-term drought. Most of the time, it's a cracked, glittering expanse of salt crust and mirages, the kind of landscape that looks like it's been erased on purpose. But back in the 1800s, the lake was fuller, deeper, stranger, and according to a handful of local stories, alive with something no one wanted to get too close to. The first accounts of the Severe Lake Monster don't scream for attention. You won't find a massive headline in a historic paper announcing "Monster Sighted in Sevier." Instead, the creature exists in the margins, mentioned alongside the Bear Lake and Utah lake monsters. In regional write-ups about serpents lurking in Utah's inland waters, it was part of a family of beasts, a quiet cousin, a local afterthought in the catalog of the uncanny. But even those faint mentions hint at something uneasy. Witnesses, what few there were, spoke of a creature that resembled a giant snake or eel, dark and glistening, longer than a wagon and faster than a current. It was said to ripple through the water in wide S-shaped arcs, barely breaking the surface, yet leaving a wake too large to ignore. One settler reportedly described it as a dark shadow with a head that watched. Another account claimed the beast was sighted twice and never again, as if the land had reclaimed it before the story could spread. Of course, none of this was taken too seriously. Sevier Lake was isolated, dry most of the year, and overlooked by nearly everyone who didn't have a reason to cross it. There were no steamboats, no lakeside towns, no incentive to make a monster part of the tourist economy, which may be why the story never got a spotlight and why it still lingers in that haunting half space between myth and memory. But think about it, a nearly forgotten monster in a nearly forgotten lake, surrounded by a desert that doesn't want you there. If Utah's other lake creatures feel tied to legend and lore, the Sevier Lake monster feels like a relic, an evolutionary wrong turn that got caught in the land's drying throat and never quite escaped. And what if it didn't die? What if it just went underground? What if the drying of Sevier Lake didn't kill the monster, but set it free? Because not long after Sevier began to shrink, the stories of strange aquatic shapes began surfacing elsewhere, in lakes that still held water, in regions where stories could swim, in places that were suddenly, suspiciously, also home to new monsters, or in one particularly strange case, to whales, because in 1888, the Great Salt Lake had a new problem, and it wasn't a serpent, it was two whales. What if the drying of Sevier Lake didn't kill the monster, but set it free? Because not long after Sevier began to shrink, the stories of strange aquatic shapes began surfacing elsewhere, in lakes that still held water, in regions where stories could swim, in places that were suddenly, suspiciously, also home to new monsters, or in one particularly strange case, to whales, because in 1888, the Great Salt Lake had a new problem, and it wasn't a serpent, it was two whales. What if the drying of Sevier Lake didn't kill the monster, but set it free? Because not long after Sevier began to shrink, the stories of strange aquatic shapes began surfacing elsewhere. 7. Great Salt Lake whales. On the long and strange list of things that have allegedly lived in the Great Salt Lake, whales might be the most improbable. And that's saying something, considering we've already met a horse-headed lake dragon. But improbable doesn't mean impossible, especially not in Utah, where local lore doesn't just stretch the truth, it salts it, sunbakes it, and then sells it as a roadside attraction. The year was 1888, the place, the eastern shore of the Great Salt Lake. The claim that two full-grown whales had been successfully transported across the desert by a local entrepreneur named James Wickham, who, according to the story, had big plans and bigger dreams. His idea was to release the whales into the lake, let them thrive in the salty waters, and then turn the whole thing into a spectacle, a tourist draw, a money-making marvel of biology and boldness. Now let's pause here. The Great Salt Lake is roughly 4 to 5 times saltier than the ocean. It's the kind of place where even your eyelashes feel crusted after a few minutes of standing near the shore. No whales in any universe governed by science or common sense would survive in those waters, not unless they were part camel and part brine shrimp. But the story was told anyway and retold. Newspapers at the time printed the tale with suspicious enthusiasm. Some claimed the whales were seen thriving, chasing schools of fish, which don't exist in the lake, and creating such a ruckus that local hunters couldn't get within half a mile without being splashed. Others said they vanished entirely, diving to the bottom and never resurfacing, which again would be more compelling if the lake were deeper than 30 feet on average. Still, people wanted to believe. They needed to believe. In a time when the American West was transforming, railroads cutting through canyons, telegraph wires replacing oral history, settlers crowding spaces that were once sacred, these stories provided something tangible, if ridiculous, a kind of magic realism of the frontier, and the idea of whales in a desert lake was just wild enough to feel like it belonged. Over time, the Great Salt Lake whale story became one of those durable regional myths, not quite believed but never fully debunked either. It lives in newspaper archives, in tourism pamphlets, and in the back corners of local museums. People still bring it up, usually with a smirk, sometimes with a sense of genuine wonder. Could it have happened? Could someone have actually done it? And if so, where are the whales now? Biologists, of course, have an answer: nowhere. There's no record of any marine life of that size surviving or even existing in the Great Salt Lake. No bones, no sonar traces, nothing. Just a persistent echo of a story that refuses to die. But the lake doesn't care about science or skepticism. It's too old for that. It contains too many oddities already: steam vents, floating islands, mirages, disoriented birds, and the occasional glimpse of something moving just under the surface that no one can quite explain. A whale? Probably not, but something. And while the Great Salt Lake whales may be Utah's most bizarre aquatic hoax, not all of the state's strange creatures are so easily dismissed. Some of them walk on two legs through the forests on the edges of campsites, and if you're very quiet, if you listen, you might hear the soft crack of a branch, far too high to be from a deer. That's when you'll know you're not alone, because Utah has its own Bigfoot moving just under the surface. 8. Bigfoot, Sasquatch. The Uinta Mountains stretch across northeastern Utah like the backbone of something ancient and unfinished. Unlike most mountain ranges in North America, the Uintas run east to west, an architectural oddity of the continent's tectonic blueprint, as if nature had scribbled sideways in the middle of a vertical story, and somewhere within their ridgelines, their canyons, their forgotten logging roads and thick forests, something large walks upright through the trees. It's been called Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the hairy man, but in Utah, it has a reputation as quiet, dangerous, and unsettlingly well adapted, a creature that isn't just surviving in the wilderness, but belongs to it. While Bigfoot stories are more often associated with the Pacific Northwest, Utah has long held its own seat at the cryptozoological table. The earliest indigenous accounts from the Ute and Shoshone peoples speak of large, hairy, man-like beings who lived deep in the mountains and avoided contact with humans, not demons, not Gia, just something other. In the late 20th century, the Uintas became a hotspot for sightings. Between the 1970s and early 2000s, campers, hunters, and hikers filed reports of encounters that all started the same way, with a sound, a low grunt, a rock thrown from an unseen hand, a tree knock that echoed too far, too fast, and always the same feeling, the sense that something was watching. One notable report from 1977 involved a group of backpackers who said they encountered a large, dark figure crouching near their camp. They described it as human-shaped but massively built, at least 7 feet tall, broad-shouldered, and covered in dark brown hair. When one of the hikers shone a flashlight in its direction, the creature didn't flee. It stood, looked back, then turned and vanished into the brush with a speed and silence that didn't match its size. Other stories followed, hunters returning to find massive footprints circling their tree stands, bow hunters catching fleeting glimpses of tall figures ducking behind aspen trunks, Even a handful of thermal images captured during amateur expeditions showing humanoid shape moving in ways no person should be able to, fast, angled, and disturbingly quiet. Skeptics, of course, chalk it all up to misidentification, bears, elk, tall tales, hoaxes, but if you've ever walked a trail in the Uintas alone at dusk, you'll know the air gets thin and strange, the trees lean in, sounds travel oddly, logic bends, and suddenly the thought of something watching doesn't seem so implausible. Bigfoot believers argue that Utah offers the perfect habitat: dense forests, high alpine basins, abundant wildlife, and thousands of square miles with little to no human traffic. It's not that Bigfoot is hiding, it's that no one's really looking in the right places. Or worse, they look and they never come back. And then there's the really unsettling part. Some sightings around the Uintas don't describe just a creature, but something else, something accompanied by lights in the sky or sudden disorientation or time lapses, which brings us dangerously close to one of the strangest overlaps in Utah folklore, the intersection of cryptid and cosmic. Because in Utah, the boundary between creature and phenomenon gets blurry, and nowhere does that blurriness become more unnerving than when you're trying to decide if what flew overhead was a bird near a god. The thunderbird is next, and it doesn't knock. It nine. Thunderbird, there are skies that feel like they're made to hold gods, wide, bone-dry vaults of blue that stretch so far across the horizon you start to forget where the world ends and the heavens begin. Utah has skies like that, especially out on the plateaus, the Red Rock deserts, the high ridges where the wind speaks first and the sun follows. And if you've spent enough time under those skies, you may have heard it, a flap of wings that shakes the canyon, a rumble not quite thunder, not quite wind, a shadow that moves faster than a plane, but too low to be a bird, the thunderbird. It isn't just a bird, not really. In the cosmologies of many indigenous cultures throughout North America, including the Lakota, the Ojibwe, the Hopi, and yes, the Southern Paiute and Ute, Thunderbird is a powerful force, a sacred entity, a sky being that governs storms, commands lightning, and arrives not with warning, but with intention. In these traditions, Thunderbird isn't a cryptid, it's a presence, a spiritual phenomenon cloaked in feathers and thunderclaps. But as settlers moved west and laid their own language over the land, something shifted. Stories of giant birds, winged monsters with the wingspan of small airplanes, began cropping up in Utah newspapers and campfire retellings. These weren't just sacred beings anymore, they were sightings. One story from the early 1900s described ranchers near central Utah claiming they saw a massive bird soaring above their cattle. Not an eagle, not a hawk, something far larger, with featherless wings, some said, like a pterodactyl. Another account, this one from a group of hikers near Capitol Reef, told of a shadow that passed over the group, blotting out the sun for several seconds. When they looked up, they saw what they described as a bird with eyes like lanterns. Modern cryptozoologists have tried to explain these sightings through the lens of biology. Could it be a surviving species of teratorn, a prehistoric bird with a wingspan of 15 feet or more, or a misidentified condor, or more mundanely, just another tall tale rooted in poor lighting and wishful thinking? But even if you dismiss the idea of an actual thunderbird flapping across the Utah sky, the pattern of these stories remains eerie. The creature always arrives before or after a storm. The air gets charged, the clouds twist. People report a sudden headache, a sensation of pressure in their chest, and then the silhouette. Whether that's myth or memory is hard to say, but what makes the Thunderbird so compelling is that it doesn't feel like a monster. It feels like a signal, a warning shot from a world we stopped listening to. The rock art, of the Fremont and Barrier Canyon peoples contains clues too, stylized bird figures with outstretched wings and spiral motifs. Whether those are literal depictions or symbolic representations is unknown, but their presence hints at a long memory encoded into the land, a memory that stretches back before the state had a name, or roads or cameras, and the Thunderbird is never alone in those carvings because right beside it, etched into cliffs and cave walls, is another figure. Not a bird, not a beast, a serpent with horns. Of the Fremont and Barrier Canyon peoples contains clues too, stylized bird figures with outstretched wings and spiral motifs. Whether those are literal depictions or symbolic representations is unknown, but their presence hints at a long memory encoded into the land, a memory that stretches back 10. Horned Serpent, Utah is carved in stone, layered, windswept, and sun-scorched, but not all of its stories are written in books. Some are scratched, painted, or pecked into sandstone, left behind by people who didn't just observe the land, but lived as part of its rhythm. In canyons like 9 Mile, Sego, and Horseshoe, the walls speak, and what they show again and again is something long, coiled, and crowned, the horned serpent. In the mythology of many native cultures across the Americas, horned serpents are not mere animals, they're powerful spiritual beings. Often associated with water, lightning, and transformation, they occupy a symbolic realm between chaos and prediction, fear and reverence. In the southeast, it's known as Uktina. In the Great Basin and Southwest, versions appear in Ute, Hopi, and Fremont traditions, and in Utah, its image is unmistakable, etched into the rock in winding shapes, with prominent horns or plumes rising from the head. To the casual visitor, it might look like just another snake motif, but to those who study rock art, these depictions are different. The Fremont and Barrier Canyon style panel show serpents that don't slither, they loom. Some are flanked by spirals, others by human-like figures or mysterious glyphs that seem to suggest a narrative lost to time. In some panels, the serpent appears to be emerging from water. In others, it coils around smaller animals or even people. What do they mean? Some anthropologists interpret the horned serpent as a symbol of water sources, sacred springs, rivers, or seasonal flows, vital in the arid climate of Utah's canyonlands. Others believe it represents a sky-water link, connecting storms to the earth through lightning and rain. In this reading, the horns aren't just for show. They signal divine status, like a crown. This wasn't a thing to be hunted. It was a thing to be honored and perhaps feared. Still, local stories occasionally blur the line between spiritual symbol and living legend. Ranchers near 9 Mile Canyon have passed down tales of strange tracks by the river, unnatural grooves, wide and deep, that vanish into water and don't return. There are murmurs of sightings, always indirect, of something dark and long, slipping through reeds or vanishing beneath a still pool just before someone looked directly. Skeptics, as usual, lean on explanations like erosion, ancient flood paths, or the human tendency to find patterns in randomness. But the recurrence of the horned serpent across cultures, and specifically in the high desert of Utah, hints at something deeper, something that might not care whether it's seen or believed, as long as it's remembered. Because that's the thing about rock art. It's not an exhibition, it's a message. Not just what the ancestors saw, but how they wanted us to see it. A warning, a teaching, a map. Hard to say, but one thing is certain. Wherever the horned serpent appears in Utah's stone record, it's not alone. The panels often include tall, narrow figures with hollow eyes and featureless faces. They look like spirits. They feel like watchers, and they don't blink. In the sandstone corridors of the San Rafael Swell, another kind of presence waits. It doesn't move, it doesn't breathe, but it sees you. They call them the ghosts of Barrier Canyon. A warning, a teaching, a map. Hard to say, but one thing is certain. Wherever the horned serpent appears in Utah's stone record, it's not alone. The panels often include tall, narrow figures with hollow eyes and featureless faces. 11. Barrier Canyon Ghosts. Step into the sandstone amphitheaters of the San Rafael Swell, Black Dragon Wash, Horseshoe Canyon, the Maze District, and you'll find yourself surrounded by silence, not just the absence of sound, but a charged stillness, the kind that settles in just before a lightning strike or after something unseen moves past. And if you look up at the canyon walls, you'll see why. They're watching you. Looming there, tall, thin, eyeless, are the ghosts of Barrier Canyon. Ancient pictographs painted in dark reds and muted purples, some over 8 feet high, with elongated bodies and vacant expressions. They aren't animals, they aren't people, they are something else, something otherworldly, and they've been standing there, unmoving and unblinking for at least 1,000 years. These figures are part of the Barrier Canyon style of rock art, believed to have been created by the archaic desert culture people long before the Fremont or ancestral Puebloans made their mark in the region. Some of the art dates as far back as 2000 BC. That's older than Rome, older than the concept of Utah. And yet these figures feel as fresh as a nightmare you had last night, but can't quite shake. They're often referred to as ghosts, and once you see them, you understand why. No arms, no legs, no faces, just deep eye sockets or gaping holes where features should be. Some seem to float, others are flanked by animal-like companions, snakes, birds, insect forms. There are horns, there are antennae, and occasionally there are dots or rays emerging from the heads of the figures as if they're channeling energy or thought or something. No one knows exactly what they are. Some archaeologists interpret them as shamanic visions, images painted by medicine people in trance states, reaching across dimensions to record what they saw. Others think they may represent ancestral spirits, beings of myth and cosmology rendered in symbolic code. Still others whisper about extraterrestrial contact, ancient astronaut theories, or portals between worlds. The ghosts don't clarify, they just stare. Even the land seems to react to them. People who hike into Horseshoe Canyon, home to the most famous of these figures, the Great Gallery, often describe a sense of being watched, followed, or somehow measured. Cameras glitch, voices drop to whispers, and more than a few visitors admit they feel relief only once they've left the canyon entirely, as if the very cliffs were holding their breath until the intruders were gone. Skeptics, of course, point to the power of suggestion. You're in a remote canyon, surrounded by thousand-year-old art that looks like it came from a fever dream. Of course, your brain invents things, but even the most rational observers admit there's a mood here, a weight, because these aren't just doodles on stone. They were made deliberately, carefully, high up on walls in hard-to-reach places, meant to be seen, meant to be remembered, and maybe meant to be feared. But the ghosts aren't alone. In nearby panels, another set of figures appears, more human in shape, but not quite. Their heads are adorned with horns, antlers, or strange protrusions. They don't look like shamans. They look like something else. And in eastern Utah, their presence has endured. They are the horned people, the watchers. The Fremont called them something. We just call them the others. Up on walls in hard-to-reach places, meant to be seen, meant to be remembered, and maybe meant to be feared. But the ghosts aren't alone. In nearby panels, another set of figures appears, more human in shape, but not quite. Their heads are adorned with horns, antlers, or strange protrusions. They don't look like shamans. They look like something else. And in eastern Utah, their presence has endured. They are the horned people, the watchers. The Fremont called them something. We just call them the others. Up on walls. 12. Fremont horned anthropomorphs. Eastern Utah is dotted with ancient messages, if you know where to look. Canyon walls, cliff faces, rock overhangs, they all carry fragments of a language no one alive still speaks. But perhaps the most unsettling parts of this old silent dialogue are the Fremont horned anthropomorphs. Tall, stylized human like figures adorned with horns. They stand frozen in pigment and stone, arms at their sides or stretched in impossible gestures. Their heads are crowned with antlers, prongs, or elaborate headgear that looks like something between a ritual costume and a biological mutation. They don't smile. They don't gesture like people. They face you dead on, centered, confrontational, created by the Fremont culture between AD 300 and 1300. These figures appear all over the Colorado Plateau, from the Book Cliffs to Capitol Reef, from remote ravines to high, open walls where nothing else stands. Archaeologists refer to them politely as anthropomorphs, a safe, neutral word that means human-shaped. But that's where the familiarity ends, because while they may look like us, they don't feel like us. The Fremont people were horticulturalists, hunters, artists, and astronomers. They left behind a stunning record of their existence: granaries tucked into cliff alcoves, petroglyphs of bighorn sheep and maize, and these horned figures painted with uncanny detail. Unlike the older, ghostly pictographs of Barrier Canyon style, the Fremont anthropomorphs are often more defined, muscular, standing tall with broad shoulders and symmetrical limbs. Some wear necklaces, some are covered in geometric patterns as though their bodies were woven or tattooed. Others have circular eyes and blank expressions like masks carved from obsidian. And then there are the horns. Sometimes they curl like rams. Other times they jut straight out like antennae or antlers. In many panels, more than one figure is depicted as if in procession or ritual. Are these gods, priests, dancers, something in between? One theory posits that they represent shamans in ceremonial headdress, midway through transformation, wearing symbolic attire meant to connect with animal spirits or celestial powers. Another theory leans darker, that these are depictions of beings from oral legends, spirit entities, possibly predatory or divine, that once walked alongside people. And another possibility, rarely voiced out loud by archaeologists but whispered in local circles, is that they weren't representations at all, that they were observational, that the Fremont saw something and recorded it. Modern-day visitors sometimes describe a strange feeling when standing before these figures. Not reverence exactly, not fear either, just a strange primal awareness, like something is still watching back, like the horned ones never really left, like their purpose is unfinished. And the horned anthropomorphs never appear in isolation. They're surrounded by symbols, snakes, spirals, stars, grids, a visual language now broken, but once rich with meaning. Some researchers believe these panels were cosmological maps. Others say they mark places of power where earth and sky meet, where ritual mattered. And what's most unsettling is that in places miles apart, created centuries apart. 13. Skinwalker, Navajo, Yi Nald Lushi. There are places in Utah where even silence feels hostile. The wind doesn't just whisper through the sagebrush, it presses heavy and sharp. The landscape feels too still, as if it's holding back a story it doesn't want to tell. In these places, on the edge of mesas, in the dry, washed shadows, across the four corners and deep into the Winta Basin, you'll hear one name spoken low and never casually: Skinwalker. In the Diné Navajo language, the word is Yi Naldlushi, which translates roughly to "with it, he goes on all fours." It is not a term to be used lightly, not a creature of folklore, but a being of dark medicine, an identity, not just an entity. In traditional teachings, a skinwalker is someone who has chosen to forsake the sacred laws of harmony and healing, stepping over into a path of power taken through forbidden means. It's not a ghost, not a monster. it's a person, or at least it was. The skinwalker is said to be able to take the form of animals: coyote, wolf, owl, fox, or even, in rare accounts, other humans. It wears the skin of its chosen form and moves with unnatural speed, often accompanied by a sense of dread so intense it paralyzes anyone nearby. It's fast, it's cunning, and perhaps most disturbingly, it knows you. It knows your name, and it doesn't forget. What separates skinwalker stories from standard creature sightings is their intimacy. These are not tales told from a distance, they happen close. A knock on a window at midnight and in the middle of nowhere, a figure seen crossing a field too quickly, then vanishing into a bush that no longer rustles, a low growl heard just outside the tent, followed by the sound of something standing up. Outsiders have taken the concept and warped it, folding it into paranormal tourism, campfire horror, and online creepypasta. But to the Navajo and many other native communities, skinwalkers are no joke. They are part of a belief system that includes balance, protection, and respect for the spirit world. To speak of them flippantly, or worse, to seek them out, is not just offensive, it's dangerous. Still, stories persist, particularly in the Uinta Basin, where generations of both native and non native residents have reported strange encounters on the edges of ranches, along forgotten roads, near the reservation's borderlands. Eye shine where no animal should be, shapes that shift mid movement, voices that call out using a loved one's exact tone from deep in the trees. Some say the land remembers what we forget, that the basin, so rich in ancient petroglyphs, sacred mountains, and spiritual histories, is more than a backdrop. It's a boundary, and what crosses that boundary is never random. Not far from here lies a now infamous ranch, one surrounded by decades of bizarre occurrences, from strange lights in the sky to mutilated livestock to inexplicable cold spots and machines that fail without reason. But among the most chilling tales from that ranch is of a massive, wolf-like beast that would not fall, even when shot at close range, a creature that defied logic and refused to die. They called it the dire wolf of Skinwalker Ranch. And what crosses that boundary is never random. Not far from here lies a now infamous ranch, one surrounded by decades of bizarre occurrences, from strange lights in the sky to mutilated livestock to inexplicable cold spots and machines that fail without reason. But among the most chilling tales from that ranch is of a massive, wolf-like beast that would not fall, even when shot at close range, a creature that defied logic. 14. Dire wolf-like beast of Skinwalker Ranch. The Uinta Basin isn't exactly shy about its weirdness. The air feels charged there, static-laced and strangely thick, like it's waiting for something to arrive or already hiding something you're not supposed to see. This is a place where compasses spin, electronics fry, and stories multiply like shadows at dusk, and no single location has absorbed more of that unease than the 512-acre stretch of high desert known simply as Skinwalker Ranch. The ranch, once known as the Sherman Ranch, has been called many things: a hotspot, a window area, a cursed property, a scientific mystery wrapped in hearsay and guarded by men in unmarked vehicles. But among all the phenomena reported here, unidentified aerial lights, poltergeist activity, cattle deaths, unexplained radiation, the story that refuses to fade is the one about the wolf. And not just any wolf, a massive, ancient-looking, gray-furred thing the size of a small car, the kind of creature that shouldn't exist outside of Pleistocene fossils and museum placards, a wolf too big, too calm, and too immune to bullets. In 1994, Tom and Ellen Sherman moved their family onto the property. Within weeks, they were cataloging the inexplicable, but one of the first incidents they ever reported involved a wolf or something like it. On a quiet evening, as the family was outside unpacking, a large wolf approached. At first, it didn't seem aggressive. It was calm, almost domesticated. It allowed itself to be petted by the Sherman's teenage son. It just stood there, huge, silent, patient. Then, without warning, it lunged at a nearby calf. What followed was confusion, panic, and gunfire. Tom Sherman grabbed his .357 Magnum and shot the animal at point-blank range. Nothing. He shot again and again. Still, the creature did not retreat. It didn't even flinch. Eventually, Tom resorted to a higher caliber rifle. Still no visible effect. Finally, after several shots, the creature backed off, not limping, not bleeding, just done. They followed the tracks, large, deep paw prints, but after about 200 yards, the prints simply stopped. No blood, no body, no sign of distress, as if the animal had vanished into thin air or had never been fully here to begin with. Skeptics have tried to explain it away. Misidentification, a large dog, a hoax, but the physical details stubbornly linger. The wolf was described as nearly shoulder height to a grown man with a thick, muscular build and jaws large enough to crush bone. Its behavior wasn't typical animal aggression. It was measured, focused, deliberate, and above all, it seemed unbothered by human action. Later visitors to the ranch, paranormal researchers, private investigators, even military contractors have noted similar patterns, fleeting sightings of large, quadrupedal creatures in the distance, shadowy forms that disappear into blind spots, drones that malfunction when attempting to follow them. The beast is never caught. It never poses for cameras. It doesn't need to. And then there's the name. Dire wolf is not just poetic license. It's a real classification. Canis dirus, an extinct prehistoric predator believed to have roamed North America over 10,000 years ago. So the question becomes, was the Sherman family seeing a ghost, a throwback, or something altogether different? Because at Skinwalker Ranch, categories start to collapse. Creatures don't stay in their taxonomic lanes. Physics doesn't hold, and even time doesn't seem fully committed to its own rules. And the dire wolf might not be alone. In the same area, other figures are seen, taller, thinner, walking on two legs, with heads shaped like wolves. 15. Dogman-type apparition. There's something uniquely unsettling about a creature that stands where it shouldn't. Four-legged beasts don't walk upright, not for long, not without effort, not with intention, but in the Uinta Basin, where legends stretch across tribal memory, settler panic, and modern-day surveillance footage, stories persist of exactly that, a canine-headed figure, tall as a man, moving not like a confused animal, but like something that knows it's being watched. They call it Dogman. Unlike Bigfoot, Dogman doesn't enjoy a well-established cultural history or a line of cryptid merchandise at tourist shops. It isn't beloved. It doesn't come with soft folklore edges. This thing shows up where it shouldn't, when it shouldn't, and always leaves behind more questions than footprints. Most sightings in Utah, particularly around the Uinta Basin and the perimeter of Skinwalker Ranch, describe the creature as bipedal, over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders, elongated limbs, and a head resembling that of a wolf or large dog. But what separates Dogman from standard werewolf cliches is how it moves. Witnesses often say it walks calmly, deliberately, too fluidly for something of its size and shape. Some describe it turning its head fully toward the viewer, as if studying them, not startled, not aggressive, just aware. One of the most frequently repeated modern accounts comes from a hunter near the Book Cliffs region, not far from the basin's edge. He was tracking elk in the early morning when he spotted what he first thought was a black bear standing on its hind legs. But as he adjusted his scope, he realized it wasn't a bear at all. The creature's limbs were too long, its head too canine, its gait too casual. It looked directly at him, held that gaze for several seconds, and then walked off the trail, vanishing behind a ridge. No rush, no panic, just a kind of eerie composure, like it knew the terrain better than he ever could. Skeptics chalk these stories up to misidentification, maybe a bear, maybe a tall coyote in strange lighting, maybe a hallucination fueled by isolation and a loaded imagination. But what makes the Dogman story difficult to dismiss is its consistency across different regions and its tendency to show up where other phenomena are already active. That's the uncomfortable part. The Dogman doesn't travel alone. It's often reported in areas that already carry reputations for high strangeness, Skinwalker Ranch, for instance, or other sites with layered histories of unexplained lights, disorientation, and environmental anomalies. The creature seems less like a lone cryptid and more like part of a cluster event, one node in a larger system of weirdness. Even more curious, the overlap between Dogman sightings and those of traditional shapeshifter legends. While not identical to the Navajo Skinwalker, the Dogman narrative feels like a mutated echo, filtered through time, stripped of sacred context, and reframed in the language of modern fear. It's the suburban version of the ancient warning. The teeth are the same, but the stories have changed clothes. And here's where things get even stranger. The Dogman doesn't just haunt the deep woods. In some of the earliest lake monster stories in Utah, decades before the phrase cryptid existed, there were already whispers of aquatic creatures with oddly canine features, specifically in the Great Salt Lake. Long before Old Briny became famous, there were reports of something sleeker, quieter. 16. Antelope Island Porpoise. Early lake creature. Before there were lake dragons, flying brine beasts, or monstrous hoaxes involving whales, the Great Salt Lake had a quieter rumor. It didn't roar or rise from the water with theatrical flair. It didn't chase horses or glare with lantern eyes. It just surfaced, briefly, silently, and often enough to get people talking. The year was 1871. Utah was still young, and Antelope Island, a rocky, windswept landmass in the heart of the Great Salt Lake, was as remote as it is today. Ranchers used the island to graze livestock, and the lake, for all its inhospitable salt and shriveling ecosystem, was considered more of a nuisance than a mystery. But then came the porpoise. According to a handful of 19th century accounts, early lakegoers reported seeing a strange aquatic creature swimming off the shores of Antelope Island. It was sleek, smooth-skinned, and fast, moving in arcs above the water like a dolphin. Some compared it directly to a porpoise, though none could explain how a saltwater mammal could find its way into an isolated, hypersaline lake over 1,000 miles from any ocean. The creature's appearance was always brief. It didn't linger, didn't splash, didn't interact. It just surfaced, swam in long, curved movements, almost graceful, and vanished. At the time, it wasn't even treated as a monster. Not exactly. More of a curiosity, a footnote in the papers, something you might spot if you happen to be looking. And that's what makes the story so compelling. Unlike later Great Salt Lake legends, Old Briny, the winged dragon, the whale hoax, this one doesn't seem to have been created for spectacle. No crowds gathered, no showman charged admission. The porpoise was too modest for that. It was simply observed and then remembered, a glitch in the lake's otherwise silent programming. Skeptics say it was probably an illusion, light on water, wave patterns distorted by the lake's high mineral content. Some argue that it could have been a beaver or otter, though neither species thrives in that environment. Others suggest the early ranchers may have been projecting oceanic imagery onto the lake, seeing what they wanted to see in an otherwise alien landscape. The Great Salt Lake has always defied expectations. Maybe this was just another case of the mind making meaning where there was none, but the pattern is hard to ignore. This porpoise wasn't the last lake creature seen in the area. In fact, many of the later descriptions of Old Briny seem like evolutions of the same idea, beginning with something smooth and fast, then mutating in folklore into something bigger, meaner, and far more marketable. Some folklorists believe that the porpoise sighting was the seed from which the rest of the Great Salt Lake's monster legends grew, a calm disturbance, a ripple that became a roar. And Antelope Island, for all its desolation, still plays host to strange reports, lights over the water, shifting forms on the shoreline, an inexplicable sense that the island and the lake surrounding it is less lifeless than it appears, because just downriver, connected to this same ecosystem, is a narrow stretch of water where the legends don't swim, they slither, and according to some, they wait until nightfall before showing their eyes above the surface. They call it the Jordan River Serpent. And Antelope Island, for all its desolation, still plays host to strange reports, lights over the water, shifting forms. 17. Jordan River Serpent. The Jordan River isn't particularly wild. It's slow moving, narrow, and choked with suburban sprawl. It connects two of Utah's most storied bodies of water, Utah Lake to the south and this Great Salt Lake to the north, but in doing so, it weaves through a landscape that feels increasingly artificial: golf courses, housing developments, flood channels, freeway overpasses. It's less a river than a utility, and yet, according to more than a few unnerved locals, something unnatural still moves beneath its surface. They call it the Jordan River Serpent. It's an odd place for a monster. The river averages less than 5 feet deep in most areas. Its banks are muddy, the water often murky, and wildlife mostly limited to ducks, carp, and the occasional turtle. But for decades, maybe longer, stories have emerged of something else down there, something long, black, fast, watching. The earliest written accounts are rare, but the oral stories persist. Anglers have spoken of shadows darting beneath their boats, much too large for fish, too fluid for debris. One retired maintenance worker for Salt Lake County claimed he once saw something thick and smooth, like a giant eel, roll just beneath the waterline near a culvert during flood season. Didn't make a sound, he said. Didn't cause a ripple, just slid away. And I don't go back to that stretch no more. In some versions of the story, the creature is described as jet black with a reflective, almost rubbery skin. In others, it's scaled and has small, cold eyes, too far apart for comfort. A few accounts describe the head as vaguely canine, reminiscent perhaps of the Utah lake monster's infamous greyhound-shaped head. Could the two be related? Is the Jordan River merely a narrow corridor for a larger, migratory creature that doesn't respect county lines? Of course, biology doesn't love this theory. No known freshwater species native to Utah matches the description. The river's depth and salinity would make it inhospitable to large aquatic predators, and yet the reports persist. One particularly strange incident occurred in the late 1990s when several teenagers canoeing a bend near the Murray-Taylorsville border swore they were followed by something swimming just beneath the surface. They claimed it surfaced once, briefly, and that its eyes looked all wrong, not glowing, not red, just wrong, flat, unblinking, almost reflective. One of the kids never went back on the river again. Skeptics naturally point to common explanations: old carp, floating debris, otters, even escaped pet snakes. But these theories always hit a wall with the same detail: the eyes. Those who claim to have seen the Jordan River Serpent almost always mention the eyes. Not angry, not wild, just aware, like something observing, measuring, and uninterested in being measured in return. If this creature exists, it may be part of a larger network of water-based phenomena that connect Utah's lakes and rivers into a single fluid habitat for the unexplained, a hidden ecosystem, or maybe a shared memory, because the river itself was once sacred to the indigenous peoples who lived along its banks. It wasn't just a waterway, it was a living thing, a passage, a border, and maybe, like many old borders, it still holds something on the other side. And then there's Bear Lake again, but not the version you know from postcards and monster merchandise. This time it's something deeper, something older. They call it Top 18, Tapakanavi. Bear Lake's world-slipping creature. Bear Lake is already haunted by reputation. Tourists come for turquoise water and charming myths. Locals grow up hearing tales of the serpentine creature that supposedly prowls its depths, but beneath the surface of the more commercial Bear Lake monster story, beneath the articles, the bumper stickers, and the reenactments, there's another name, a quieter one, spoken with more reverence than flair. Tapakanavi. It's a name with roots in the Shoshone language, and depending on who you ask, it loosely translates to something like the one who slips between worlds, or he who shifts the veil. This isn't a lake monster in the traditional sense. It's not just something that lives in the water, it's something that moves through it, something that doesn't quite belong here or anywhere, because here and there aren't lines it respects. While the popular legend of the Bear Lake Monster was amplified by 19th century frontier journalism, most notably by Joseph C. Rich in 1868, Tapakanavi belongs to a different thread, a deeper one, passed orally, without drama or demand for belief. In these tellings, the creature is neither a menace nor a mascot. It is an event, a crossing, a ripple in the boundary between worlds. Shoshone elders have spoken of it not in terms of fear, but of caution. Tapakanavi is not necessarily evil, it's just not local. When it appears, things go strange. The air feels thinner. The water pulls in unnatural ways. Reflections don't quite line up with what's being reflected. Time skips or stretches. In these moments, the lake isn't just a lake, it's a threshold. Sightings, rare as they are, follow a curious pattern. They tend to occur in late summer or early fall, just before the weather shifts. Witnesses speak of seeing something massive below the surface, but not moving like an animal, not swimming, drifting sideways, almost like a curtain being drawn. Some say it looks like a coiled shape, far below, turning slowly in place. Others report flashes of silvery light that spiral in and out of the depths without any obvious source. And still others say they didn't see anything, but they felt it, like a pressure change, like static building up in the marrow of your bones. Then, just as quickly, it's gone, and the lake is calm again. Too calm. What makes Tapakanavi different from other cryptids is that it doesn't ask to be seen. It doesn't chase boats or leave tracks. It shows up when it wants to, and when it does, the event feels less like a creature encounter and more like an error in the code of reality, a glitch, a soft reminder that our world is not sealed shut, no matter how many maps and fences we draw around it. Modern folklorists have begun connecting the dots between Bear Lake's lesser-known sightings and other regional phenomena, missing time, repeating dreams, and strange light seen just before the creature is felt. Some have even gone so far as to suggest that the lake itself isn't just the creature's home, it might be the creature, or the mouth of it, because Tapakanavi isn't just what lives in the water, it's what passes through it, what brushes up against the world when no one's supposed to be looking, what remembers what came before us, and worse, what's coming next. And that quiet, sliding presence has a cousin. Far to the west in older desert stories, a race of beings once towered over the landscape, tall, red-haired, and hungry. They were not spirits, they were cannibal giants, and their name was Ka, be the creature, or the mouth of it, because Tapakanavi isn't just what lives in the water. 19. Siteka, Paiute cannibal giants. The deserts of the Great Basin feel empty on the surface. Miles of sagebrush, alkaline flats, and stone-still silence. But listen closer and you'll start to hear the stories, not from the wind or the rocks, but from the spaces between them. the silences that linger just a little too long, and out here, where Utah brushes shoulders with Nevada, the old tales speak of giants, red-haired ones, towering, relentless, and hungry. The Paiute people call them the Siteka. In oral tradition, passed down across generations, the Siteka were not mythical spirits or shapeshifters. They were flesh and blood. They walked the land, stole from neighboring tribes, and were feared not for their magic, but for their monstrous appetite. They were said to be cannibals, though the deeper implication was worse. They were not just physically monstrous, but morally broken, a warning in human form, an abomination not just of seeds but of spirit. The name Siteka is often translated to mean tule eaters, referencing the fibrous water plants they supposedly used to make rafts. According to legend, these giants used the rafts to cross shallow lakes and marshes, possibly including now dry bodies of water that once dotted western Utah and eastern Nevada. They raided camps, stole food, and vanished into the desert, and they were said to be covered in long red hair with pale skin and eyes that didn't quite blink right. Eventually, the stories say, the local tribes, Paiute among them, banded together to drive out the Siteka. The war was long and brutal. The final confrontation ended in a cave where the last of the red-haired giants were trapped and destroyed, ending their reign of terror. That cave, according to some, is Lovelock Cave in Nevada, just over the Utah border. Now here's where history and legend start to blur. In the early 20th century, guano miners digging in Lovelock Cave claimed to find large skeletal remains, much taller than average, some allegedly with tufts of red hair still attached. The discovery made headlines in the 1910s and 1920s, feeding into a pseudo-anthropological frenzy. Museums cataloged some of the bones, while others vanished into private collections. Over time, the story became muddied by hoaxes, exaggerations, and fringe theories. Mainstream archaeologists attribute the remains to the northern Paiute people, whose ancestors used the cave as a dwelling and burial site. The giant bones, they say, were the result of misidentification or unusually tall individuals, nothing supernatural. The red hair, possibly dark hair, turned reddish through mummification and mineral exposure, logicky, tidy, and not at all satisfying to those who've heard the stories. But for those who believe, or at least remain suspicious, the Siteka legend persists. Maybe the bones were real. Maybe the giants once existed and were wiped out. Or maybe they didn't vanish at all. Maybe they retreated farther into the mountains, into caves we no longer know how to find, because Utah is full of forgotten hollows and ancient ruins, places where the land dips just low enough for the past to hide in, and some say the giants never fully left. In fact, there's another one in Ute lore, just one, a solitary, monstrous figure with a hunger to match the Siteka. Its name is Siats, and it gave its name to a dinosaur, but its legend refuses to go extinct. Exposure, logicky, tidy, and not at all satisfying to those who've heard the 20. Siats, Ute cannibal giant. In Ute tradition, stories don't always come with clean morals or happy endings. Some are warnings wrapped in riddles, some are records of cosmic events, and some are simply there to remind you there are things in this world that do not care about your understanding of good and evil. One of those things is Siats, a name whispered like a warning across the canyonlands and high plateaus of Utah. Siats isn't just big, he's enormous, towering, human-shaped, but not human. A giant, yes, but not the kind that politely roams around in fairy tales or fumbles with golden harps. He is predatory, a solitary force of hunger. In Ute mythology, he is remembered as a being who ate people, not because he needed to, but because he could. His name was passed down through generations of oral tradition, remembered in stories told around fires and passed quietly between elders. He wasn't part of a race or a tribe. He was alone, and in many tellings, That's what made him more dangerous. You couldn't predict him. You couldn't reason with him. He wasn't a god. He was what happens when power loses any tether to responsibility, a being of absolute appetite. Some versions of the story describe Siats as stalking the early people, attacking their camps and stealing their children. He lived in high, inaccessible caves or on cliffs only the birds could reach. His voice echoed through the valleys. His footsteps left deep imprints in the rock. Some believed he could vanish into the stone itself, watching from within the earth. In one version of the tale, it took multiple powerful spirit beings working together to banish or kill him, not with brute force, but through cunning, trapping him, binding him, tricking him into defeat. But there's always a catch. He's never truly gone, just waiting, sealed, asleep in the places people have stopped looking. In a strange twist of modern science mirroring ancient legend, the name Siats was given to a real dinosaur discovered in Utah's Cedar Mountain Formation. In 2013, paleontologists named the apex predator Siats micrororum, a massive meat-eating theropod that ruled the land long before Tyrannosaurus rex. The name was no coincidence. The researchers were explicitly nodding to the Ute legend, a cannibal giant, a devourer. It's poetic, almost disturbingly so, a giant predator from the Cretaceous, named after a mythical one from human memory, as if the ground is still telling the same story over and over again, through bones, through myth, through names etched into stone and soil. Skeptics call it coincidence, a nice branding decision, but others, especially those who've grown up in the shadow of these stories, know better. They see the repetition, the echo, and Siats, for all his supposed extinction, doesn't feel entirely gone, because the land where he walked hasn't changed that much. The canyons are still here, the caves still gape open, the bones are still being dug up by people who think they found something extinct when all they've really done is remind it we're still here. But Siats wasn't the only elemental force feared in the Ute world. Others came with the clouds, with the lightning, with the flood. They were called the Thunder People, and when they arrived, everything stopped. Through names etched into stone and soil, skeptics call it coincidence, a nice branding decision, but others, especially those who've grown up in the shadow of these stories, know better. They see the repetition, the echo, and Siats, for all his supposed extinction, doesn't feel entirely gone, because the land where he walked hasn't changed that much. The canyons are still here, the caves still gape open, the bones are still being dug up by people who think they found something extinct when all they've really done is remind it we're still here. But Siats wasn't the only elemental force feared in the Ute world. Others came with the 21 Thunder People. In the high desert plateaus and red rock canyons of southern Utah, storms are not just weather, they are performance. One minute the sky is glassy and indifferent, the next it's howling, furious, alive. Thunder doesn't echo here so much as announce itself, and when it does, some say it's not just the clouds talking, it's the Thunder People. To the southern Paiute and other indigenous peoples of the Great Basin and Southwest, the Thunder People are not simply mythological characters or metaphors for rain. They are beings, powerful, unpredictable, sacred. Some traditions place them in the upper world, distant but deeply involved in the rhythms of earth. Others describe them as storm bringers, skywalkers, and enforcers of balance. They do not ask permission, they arrive. And when they do, they bring more than just wind. Unlike the flashier creatures of local legend, the Thunder People aren't seen so much as felt. Their presence is signaled in the sudden shift of pressure before a lightning strike, or the rolling tremor of thunder that seems to speak in a cadence too rhythmic to be random. Rain in this context is not a weather event, it's an action, something deliberate, something sent. They're also closely connected in some oral traditions to the water babies, those eerie spirit beings whose cries are heard near springs and lakes. In some versions, the thunder people and water babies aren't separate entities at all, but different expressions of the same power. One from the ski, one from the deep, a cycle of movement between above and below, between rage and grief, perhaps. Some say that when lightning strikes near a body of water, it's a sign the thunder people are searching for something or someone, that those who have offended the natural balance might be marked by a storm, that dreams of thunder may be more than dreams. Modern eyes, of course, see weather, barometric changes, static discharge, science, not spirits. But that lens doesn't explain everything. It doesn't account for the patterns in certain parts of Utah where lightning hits with uncanny repetition, where entire canyons become echo chambers for something that doesn't feel like just wind bouncing off rock. A few hikers have shared unnerving stories about getting caught in sudden storms where the rain came down so hard it seemed to vibrate, where they heard low sounds, not wind, not thunder, but a kind of voice, deep and indistinct, carried on the gusts. They returned home without injury, but couldn't sleep for days afterward. Dreams of tall, shadowed figures with flashing eyes, storms that started inside their homes. The thunder people don't behave like monsters because they aren't. They aren't malevolent, but they aren't gentle either. Like lightning itself, they serve no one's agenda but their own. They come when they are needed or when they are ignored for too long. And if you find yourself caught in one of their storms, the old advice is simple. Don't talk, don't challenge, don't run, just listen, because sometimes what sounds like thunder might be a warning, a presence, a judgment, and sometimes it's not the thunder you should fear, but what walks quietly behind it, like the trickster, like the one who creates chaos with a grin, bends the rules, and reshapes the world with a joke on his lips, the one the Utes call Coyote. The thunder people don't behave like monsters because they aren't. They aren't malevolent, but they aren't gentle either. 22. Coyote, trickster, creator. Utah is a land of paradoxes, barren yet teeming with story, dry yet carved by water, empty but never silent, and no figure embodies this contradiction better than Coyote. To the Ute people and to many tribes across the American West, Coyote is not just an animal. He is a creator, a destroyer, a teacher, a fool. He is the first storyteller and often the last to leave. You don't follow him because you trust him. You follow him because you have to know what happens next, and usually it's something you didn't see coming. Coyote appears in countless Ute and Paiute stories as a shapeshifter, a trickster, and most importantly, a cosmic meddler. He's not evil, not exactly, but he isn't reliable either. He's the kind of character who saves the world and breaks it in the same breath. He is responsible for scattering the stars, making rivers, and teaching humans how to survive. He also lies, cheats, steals. Sometimes he eats things he shouldn't. Sometimes he becomes them. And always, always he laughs. The terrain of Utah seems almost shaped for him. High mesas to perch on, long canyons to echo his stories, tracks in the sand that vanish halfway through a trail. The same places where people report strange lights or uncanny animal behavior are often places where coyote stories live, alive not just in myth, but in the very landscape. One of the most well-known Ute stories tells of how Coyote tried to play God. He was given a bag full of stars, entrusted to place them carefully in the sky. He tried for a while, gently, one by one, but Coyote is Coyote. He grew impatient, curious. He opened the bag too quickly, and the stars spilled out in chaos. The result? The Milky Way, a beautiful accident, an error that became art, and that's his pattern. He teaches through failure. He reveals wisdom through embarrassment. He is clever and foolish in the same moment, and so are we. But Coyote is more than a moral lesson or a bedtime distraction. In many indigenous teachings, he is a spirit being, a real force in the world, capable of appearing in animal form to those who need reminding that the universe doesn't owe them simplicity. Seeing a coyote on a journey can be a good omen or a bad one. It depends on your state of mind. It depends on what you're hiding, because coyote has a habit of exposing the parts of ourselves we'd rather not confront. And it's not just humans who cross his path. In some stories, he walks with other beings, giants, sky people, water spirits. Sometimes he's their friend, sometimes their enemy, sometimes both. It's hard to pin him down. That's the point. He is the ultimate boundary breaker between human and animal, between wisdom and chaos, between life and story. And even now, when you see a coyote cross the road at dusk, pausing just long enough to meet your gaze before trotting away, part of you wonders, was that just an animal? Or was that something else wearing a familiar shape? Because if coyote walks the land, then his counterpart can't be far behind. A different kind of presence, quieter, more solemn, bound to the old ways. They say if coyote is the trickster, then wolf is the one who watches. He walks with other beings, giants, sky people, water spirits. Sometimes he's their friend, sometimes their enemy, sometimes both. It's hard to pin him down. That's the point. He is the ultimate boundary breaker between human and animal, between wisdom and chaos, between life and story. And even now, when you see a coyote cross the road at dusk, pausing just long enough to meet your gaze. 23. Wolf, the virtuous counterpart. In the mythology of the Ute people, and in the broader landscape of Great Basin indigenous storytelling, there are few figures more morally grounded than Wolf. Where coyote is impulsive, Wolf is deliberate. Where coyote bends reality to his will, or simply breaks it for amusement, Wolf walks with caution, responsibility, and dignity. If coyote is the fire that tests the world, Wolf is the cool wind that carries its memory. But make no mistake, Wolf is not some tame spirit of harmony. He is powerful, revered, capable of violence when required, but his stories don't revolve around chaos for chaos's sake. They revolve around duty, endurance, and the long view. He is often seen as a guardian of people, a teacher of laws, and a protector of balance. He is, in many ways, everything coyote is not, and that's why the two are often paired together in myth, each making the other's nature more visible. In the Ute worldview, Wolf is an ancient figure who existed before people as we know them. In some tellings, he helped shape the landscape, naming animals and plants, setting the rhythms of the seasons, and establishing the rules by which humans should live. Unlike coyote, who stumbles into wisdom through foolishness, Wolf earns his knowledge. He watches, he learns, he acts only when the time is right. One tale speaks of Wolf teaching humans how to hunt with respect, not to take more than they need, not to waste, and never to hunt for sport. Another describes him intervening in a conflict between rival clans, guiding them toward peace not through force, but through shared survival. He is rarely loud, rarely central, but his presence is always felt. When things go wrong, the stories ask, what would Wolf have done instead? While coyote lives in the foreground of myth, flashy, attention-grabbing, endlessly quotable, Wolf often lives in the background, shaping the moral terrain. He's not the one who stirs the pot. He's the one who restores the kitchen after the fire, and perhaps that's why his presence lingers more quietly in the Utah landscape, not in punchlines, but in stillness, in loyalty, in long trails through snow that vanish only at the ridgeline. Wolf isn't just a mythological figure either. He's also an echo in the real ecology of Utah. Before widespread hunting and settlement pushed them out, wolves once roamed freely across the state. Their howls rang through the Uintas and the southern canyons. Their tracks ran alongside rivers now lined with highways. And though officially extinct from much of Utah by the 1930s, wolf sightings still trickle in, reports of lone grays in remote corners, of distant howls, too low for coyotes, too heavy to ignore. Whether these are remnants of a returning species or echoes of something older is up for debate. But in stories, wolf never really left. And if coyote represents the unpredictable spirit of the land, wolf is its conscience, its memory, its quiet resistance to decay. Together they shaped the early world in Ute belief, and their stories continue to shadow each other, as if bound by cosmic necessity. But there is one more figure in the sacred triad, stranger still, less understood, neither fully man nor fully animal. They call him Sinoff, the half-man, half-wolf origin being, and his footsteps are said to be written into the stone itself. Too low for coyotes, too heavy to ignore. Whether these are remnants of a returning species or echoes of something older is up for debate. But in stories, wolf never really left. 24. Sinoff, half man, half wolf. Sinoff is not a name you're likely to hear unless you're listening carefully, very carefully, to the deeper layers of Ute storytelling. Not the stories for tourists or textbooks, the old ones, the ones told slowly with pauses, where words feel heavier than they should, and every silence says something. Sinoff is different. He doesn't fit neatly into the trickster mold like coyote, nor does he carry the moral clarity of wolf. He lives somewhere in between, balancing human and animal, spirit and flesh. And like the hybrid form he wears, part man, part wolf, his stories are built on dualities, contradictions, boundaries blurred beyond recognition. In the Ute tradition, Sinoaf is often referred to as one of the first beings, a culture shaper who walked the land when it was still forming. Unlike Coyote, who scattered stars and stories through chaotic improvisation, Sinoaf was methodical. He didn't merely trick or test. He formed things, people, languages, places, and then in some stories he disappeared, blending back into the land, waiting for a time when he'd be needed again. Descriptions of Sinoaf's appearance are scarce and symbolic. He is not just a man who turns into a wolf, nor a wolf that learned to stand upright. He is both at once. A tall, human-like figure with lupine features, elongated snout, ears that twitch with purpose, and eyes that see further than humans should. He walks on two legs but runs on four when he chooses. His voice is said to be deep and clear, able to mimic both animal growls and human speech. He understands the languages of birds, rivers, and stones. Sinoff is not just a character in old stories, he's an explanation, a reason why some places feel older than others, why certain cliffs seem shaped for feet that don't match any animal, why the echoes in certain canyons don't quite return the way they should. Where Coyote left behind messes and questions, Sinoaf left structure, the foundations of early life, the spiritual grammar of the land, and yet he is also associated with a lingering sense of unease, as if he's not entirely on our side, as if his presence is a reminder that humans were not the first to walk this land, nor the last to shape it. In some Ute stories, Sinoaf appears in dreams, especially to those standing at moral crossroads, not to instruct, but to watch, to measure. His silence is often taken as judgment, not harsh, but unflinching. Modern interpretations sometimes blend Sinoaf with werewolf mythology, but that misses the point. He's not a monster. He's not a curse. He's origin, the living threshold between wildness and civilization, instinct and ritual. He reminds us that we were once part of the animal world and still are, even if we try to forget. And in Utah, there are places where his influence is still felt. Rock formations shaped like standing figures, wolf tracks that vanish into human footprints, areas where the wind carries a voice that doesn't sound entirely human, but speaks in a rhythm your bones understand. Sinaf doesn't demand belief. He doesn't leave claw marks or bite wounds. He leaves patterns, and if you can read them, you begin to realize that some parts of Utah's mythology aren't gone. They're just sleeping under the surface, which brings us to a different kind of shape, less human, less animal, but no less unnerving. In the wind-worn badlands of Emery County, the rocks themselves are alive with mischief. They call them the goblins of Goblin Valley. Even if we try to forget. And in Utah, there are places where his influence is still felt. Rock formations shaped like standing figures, wolf tracks that vanish into human footprints, areas where the wind carries a voice that doesn't sound entirely human, but speaks in a rhythm your bones understand. 25. Goblins of Goblin Valley. There are places in Utah where the land doesn't look real. Goblin Valley is one of them, tucked into the middle of nowhere in Emery County, far from cell service, supermarkets, or anything remotely resembling normal. It feels like a forgotten level from a dream you half remember having as a child. The sky is too wide, the ground is too red, and the rocks are wrong. Thousands of mushroom-shaped formations, technically called hoodoos, rise up from the desert floor, each one uniquely warped by millennia of wind and water. They resemble toadstools, melting statues, hunched-over trolls, even petrified silhouettes of people who forgot to leave. In the right light, the valley looks like it's holding its breath. In the wrong light, it looks like it's holding a grudge. Local lore passed quietly among campers, rangers, and more than a few night hikers doesn't just refer to these shapes as hoodoos. They call them goblins, not the fairy tale kind with pointy hats and riddles, the Utah kind, the still kind, the kind that might move when you're not looking. Stories about the goblins of Goblin Valley go back generations. Some say the formations were once living beings, tricksters, trespassers, or spirits caught between worlds, turned to stone by ancient magic or natural justice. Others believe the goblins are still alive, just frozen, waiting for night to fall or a specific alignment of the stars to wake them again. And a few people, quiet people, the kind who don't like to be interviewed, will tell you that they've seen them move. One local family, camping off-grid in the 1980s, claimed they were exploring the outer edges of the valley when they noticed that the landscape behind them didn't look quite the same on the way back. Not in a "we took the wrong turn" way, but in a "those rocks weren't there before" way. They left that night, didn't unpack the tent, didn't finish dinner, just left. Another story involves a group of geology students camping near the park's perimeter in the early 2000s. They set up motion sensor cameras more for fun than research. The next morning, one camera was missing. The others showed nothing unusual except for a single frame of static, white, blurry, unexplainable. One student said the static felt louder than it looked. He dropped out mid-semester. Rational explanations, of course, are plentiful. Optical illusions, erosion, shadows shifting as the sun arcs across the sky. Goblin Valley is a masterclass in pareidolia, the human tendency to see faces in randomness, and yet the sheer volume of faces carved into the rocks, the way the valley seems to be watching you back, is hard to ignore. Even in official state materials, Goblin Valley leans into the name. It's a branding win, sure, but it also reflects a deeper truth. This place feels animated, not alive exactly, but aware. The air hums differently. The wind loops instead of moving in straight lines, and the silence doesn't feel empty. It feels occupied, and when the sun sets and the red rock turns to black silhouette, the goblins fade from sight. But not from presence, because even as the valley sleeps, something in the air still stirs, something with wings and salt and a bad temper, something that once slithered but now flies. They call it the winged brine dragon. The way the valley seems to be watching you back is hard to ignore. Even in official state materials, Goblin Valley leans into the name. It's a branding win, sure, but it also reflects a deeper truth. This place feels animated, not alive exactly, but aware. The air hums differently. The wind loops instead of moving in straight lines. And the silence doesn't feel empty, it feels occupied. And when the sun sets and the red rock turns to black silhouette, the goblins fade from sight, but not from presence, because even at 26, Great Salt Lake, winged brine dragon. The Great Salt Lake has never been a friendly place. It's too salty for fish, too shallow for ships, too vast to ignore. It doesn't shimmer, it glares. It doesn't reflect the sky, it absorbs it. Even standing near it, you can feel something off in the air, not just the scent of brine and decay, but something older, like the lake remembers every time someone tried to tame it, and somewhere in those memories, something grew wings. They call it the winged brine dragon. Unlike its older sibling, Old Briny, the horse-headed monster of 1877 fame, this newer legend didn't come out of the 19th century newspapers. It came later, searly, like salt crust building on driftwood. Modern sightings, modern embellishments, modern fears layered over an old, uncomfortably persistent myth, where Old Briny slithered along the surface like a massive crocodilian phantom. The winged brine dragon flies. Sort of, the stories vary. Some describe it gliding just above the surface of the water, kicking up salty mist in long streaks. Others say it launches from the islands, Antelope, Fremont, Gunnison, leaping into the air with a wingspan wide enough to cast a moving shadow across entire beaches. There are reports of a leathery texture to the wings, sometimes feathered, sometimes bat-like. No one seems to agree, except on one point. It doesn't look like it should belong here. The earliest whisperings of a winged version of the lake monster began in the 1980s, around the time that Old Briny was enjoying a small resurgence in local media. But instead of simply reviving the horse-headed, serpent-bodied creature of the 1800s, the stories began to shift. They evolved. Some said Old Briny had been seen again, but this time it flew. Others insisted it was a different creature entirely, a mutation, a cousin, a new phase. Maybe the lake changed it. Some believe that the increasing salinity of the Great Salt Lake, now nearly 10 times that of the ocean in places, has transformed more than just the ecology, that the creature once bound to the water had no choice but to adapt, to grow wings, to escape. Sightings intensified around the early 2000s, particularly near the western shorelines and the uninhabited stretches around Stansbury Island. Campers reported strange howling sounds, not wind, not coyotes, echoing off the salt flats. A few claimed to see a black shape flying just above the lake at night, no lights, no engine, just a smooth, low glide that vanished into the dark without a sound. Photos? Always blurry. Videos? Unavailable or lost. The usual currency of cryptid folklore. Skeptics blame birds, pelicans, herons, or migrating species caught in unusual lighting, but even bird watchers admit that what's being described doesn't fit the behavior or build of any known species in the area. And the fact that these sightings often happen around dusk, when the light distorts. 27. Stansbury Island Cave Chaser. Stansbury Island isn't really an island, not anymore. It's connected to the mainland by a narrow causeway, accessible by dirt roads, and frequented mostly by hikers, hunters, and locals who don't mind the sulfur-rich wind rolling off the Great Salt Lake. It's stark, rocky, and deceptively quiet. Nothing about it screams monster lair. And maybe that's what makes the next story so hard to ignore, because this is where the winged brine dragon stopped flying and started chasing. The tale first surfaced in local circles in the early 2000s, passed through grainy forum posts, half-remembered conversations in hunting shops, and the occasional "you didn't hear it from me" confession. According to the story, a group of 3 men Weekend explorers with a taste for backcountry hikes were camping overnight on Stansbury Island. It wasn't their first time. They knew the terrain. They weren't the kind to scare easy. That changed sometime after midnight. One of the men, who later gave a secondhand account to a friend, who, of course, gave it to the internet, described hearing something strange from the ridgeline above their camp, a sharp, rhythmic scraping sound like claws on stone. At first, they assumed it was wind knocking loose gravel. Then came the growling, low, guttural, but distant until it wasn't. As the sound got closer, they caught a glimpse of something silhouetted against the moonlight. It was massive, lumbering at first, then unnaturally fast. The figure dropped from the rocks above and began moving toward them, not stumbling, not slithering, but bounding, closing distance in a way that didn't make sense for the terrain. That's when they ran, not toward their car, but toward a small cave opening they'd spotted earlier while hiking. They scrambled inside, breath ragged, flashlights trembling, and for several minutes, all they could hear was the pounding of their own hearts and something else circling just outside the cave's mouth. Then silence, followed by the sound of breathing, close, heavy, like it was waiting. They stayed in that cave until dawn. When they finally stepped out, there was nothing. No tracks, no sign of struggle, no damage to their gear. Just the unmistakable feeling that something had been there, watching, and worse, waiting. The story never made the news. No official reports, no follow-up investigation, just a growing ripple in the cryptid folklore around the Great Salt Lake, where the line between Old Briny, the winged brine dragon, and this cave-chasing apparition began to blur. Some say the creature in the story wasn't a new beast at all. It was the same one from 1877, mutated over time by the salt, by the shifting land, by the evolving fears of the people who live around it. Others claim it's a guardian, not a predator, that the caves on Stansbury Island aren't just holes in the rock, they're thresholds, and whatever lives there has been guarding them for a 28 giant brine shrimp. Cinema legend. The Great Salt Lake is famous for many things: its size, its salinity, its smell. But if you were a kid growing up anywhere near the Wasatch Front, odds are you also heard one of its weirder reputations, that somewhere beneath the thick, cloudy waters, a giant brine shrimp was waiting. Yes, brine shrimp, the same squirming, barely visible sea monkeys you might have raised in a plastic tank as a science experiment, except this one was no speck. This one was a monster, an enormous crustacean horror with too many legs and nowhere near enough charm. But unlike most of Utah's mythical creatures, the giant brine shrimp wasn't born in ancient legend or whispered around pioneer campfires. It came to life in a more modern and stranger way, through film. The year was 1976. The place, Salt Lake City. A short film called Attack of the Brine Shrimp debuted on local screens as a tongue-in-cheek, low-budget monster flick made by students and independent filmmakers. The premise was simple. Due to chemical dumping, of course, the Great Salt Lake's brine shrimp mutated into building-sized behemoths, rising from the salty depths to wreak havoc on the unsuspecting residents of the valley. It was satire, homemade horror, but the image stuck. For a state always teetering between the spiritual and the absurd, the monstrous brine shrimp quickly found a life beyond the screen. Kids began to treat it like a legitimate urban legend. Adults referenced it with just enough sarcasm to keep you guessing. Was it really a joke? Was that film inspired by something someone had seen out there on the lake? Something they didn't quite understand? Suddenly, people were reporting sightings, not of actual shrimp the size of boxcars, but of strange shapes moving under the lake's surface, unusual wake patterns, mysterious, bubbling in shallow coves. Some claimed that the creatures had simply gone dormant again, waiting for just the right environmental trigger, pollution, salinity shifts, lunar cycles, to reemerge. More than a few amateur monster hunters took it seriously enough to investigate. In the 1980s and 90s, stories popped up in local newspapers and community bulletins about strange tracks found near the shore, never explained, missing boats always blamed on wind, and organic mass sightings near Antelope Island. Most of it was easily debunked. Some of it wasn't. The legend spread so widely that it eventually became a kind of running joke in Utah pop culture. Souvenir shops sold brine shrimp keychains, tourist guides winked at the idea, a handful of schools even used the giant brine shrimp as a mascot, equal parts inside joke and low-key local myth. But the strangeness of the creature wasn't just its absurdity, it was what it represented. Unlike the ancient spirit beings, the shapeshifters, or the lake serpents, this creature was ours, a man-made myth, a radioactive reflection of the industrial era, a monster not born from nature, but from what we did to it, from what we continue to do. And that's what makes the giant brine shrimp linger in local lore, not because it was real, but because it felt like it could become real, a final, bloated echo of a poisoned ecosystem rising from a dying lake to remind us what we've ignored. Because in truth, the giant brine shrimp was never alone. It was just one more monster in a growing pattern, a pattern that spreads across Utah's lakes, from Bear Lake to Sevier to Utah Lake, where water doesn't just hold life, but mystery. And together, they're known as the lake dragons. This creature was ours, a man-made myth. 29. Lake Dragons of Utah. If you zoom out, way out, and look at a map of Utah, something odd starts to appear. Not in the lines or borders or topography, but in the stories. There's a pattern, like a constellation, that only becomes visible once you stop looking at stars and start looking at the spaces between them. It's not one lake, it's all of them. Bear Lake, Utah Lake, Fish Lake, Sevier Lake, the Great Salt Lake, and a dozen smaller bodies of water in between. Almost every one of them has a creature, a ripple, a shadow, a name whispered over campfires or muttered with a shrug. I heard about something up there. They call them the lake dragons. It's not an official classification. You won't find it in a museum exhibit or geological survey. It's a term that's drifted into local lexicon, used by those who've noticed the uncanny frequency of monster sightings across the state's lakes. Newspaper columns, blog posts, fireside tales, they all quietly link these creatures together, not because they're the same, but because they might be related. Across time and location, the details shift. One has a horse's head, another the slither of a snake, another still, fins like airplane wings. But a few elements stay disturbingly consistent: massive size, unnatural movement, brief visibility, and an uncanny sense of presence. Historically, the Bear Lake monster got the most attention, thanks to 19th century newspaper hype, but Utah Lake had its own serpent, Fish Lake its own phantom, Sevier Lake, long since reduced to salt and dust, had rumors of something large and black swimming through its occasional floodwaters, each one isolated, and yet somehow not alone. In the 20th century, this pattern started to coalesce. In 1934, a column in a regional paper referred to Utah's Dragon Lakes, noting perhaps half seriously that the state seemed peculiarly inclined toward water-bound beastliness. In the early 2000s, a Deseret News article bundled 5 of these monster tales together under the tongue-in-cheek headline, "Mythical Beasts Lurk in 5 Utah Lakes." The tone was playful. The subtext? Uneasy, because what do you do with a map that won't stop whispering? You follow it. Some cryptozoologists believe the lake dragons aren't individual creatures at all, but expressions of the same phenomenon, a regional anomaly. something geological or perhaps biological, a species of unknown aquatic megafauna that moves between these inland lakes through subterranean water systems, leftovers from the ancient Lake Bonneville that once swallowed most of Utah in prehistoric times. Others reject biology altogether. They lean toward the metaphysical. They say the water holds memory, that what we call monsters are echoes, events, trapped time, that every lake in Utah, from the grand to the forgotten, holds a doorway, and sometimes 30 monster skulls and tusks. In the 1870s, before Utah had fully settled into statehood and before lake monsters were reduced to folklore footnotes or roadside gift shop mascots, something strange started turning up along the muddy, receding shores of Utah Lake. Bones, big ones, and not just any bones, fragments of skulls, rib-like arcs buried in silt, and most dramatically, what local settlers described as tusks, long, curved, and too large for any known animal still living in the valley. These weren't vague impressions in the dirt or fossilized rumors. These were physical objects, tangible, weighty, and utterly out of place. Newspaper clippings from the time describe several discoveries near the lake's edge, especially around Provo and Saratoga Springs. One article published in 1871 claimed that a group of men had unearthed a massive skull-like structure with sockets the size of fists and a strange twisted horn protruding from the base. Another account, later that same decade, reported ivory-colored protrusions found while dredging irrigation ditches near the shoreline, resembling tusks, but brittle and with no clear source. Naturally, people connected the dots. If Utah Lake had long been home to reports of a serpentine creature with the head of a greyhound or a horse, and if enormous bones were now being pulled from the lake bed, well, the conclusion practically wrote itself. The monster was real, and they had found its remains. At least that's how the story went. Skeptics, and there were plenty even then, offered simpler explanations. The most common theory was that the bones belonged to mammoths or mastodons, long extinct megafauna that once roamed North America. Utah, after all, is no stranger to prehistoric remnants. Fossils and ancient bones turn up regularly across the state, from the dry desert flats to the Uinta Mountains. In fact, entire skeletons of Ice Age creatures have been recovered less than 100 miles from the lake, but there were problems with that theory. For one, the condition of the bones, some reportedly soft, pliable, not fully fossilized, didn't match the expected preservation state of Ice Age remains. Second, many of the reported bones were found not deep in the ground, but near the surface, suggesting a much more recent origin. And third, there were the witnesses, not just farmers or fishermen, but doctors, land surveyors, even a few military officers stationed nearby, people with little to gain and reputations to protect. And they swore what they saw wasn't mammoth, it wasn't cow, it wasn't anything they'd seen before. That's where the mystery hardened. As the years passed and interest in lake monsters faded, many of the bones disappeared, lost